which has for the last 10 years dominated government policy, which says, yes, we would love to feed starving children during the Christmas holidays, but we just can't afford it. And even though it's clearly nonsense, it still resonates with people because we see the government can create money whenever it needs to.
Hi everyone. Just a few words before we get started. First of all, our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN on the internet. And you can currently get 35% of 12 months of ExpressVPN if you follow the link in the description below. Also, you'll find a link there for my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, which is available to order on Amazon and bookshop.org. Finally, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Your help is how we grow. So, here's the interview. Hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am joined by Mark E. Thomas, the author of 99%, a professor at the IE Business School and a graduate of mathematics from Cambridge University. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So the reason that I got in touch and wanted to speak to you is because you're addressing so many issues that I see as problematic for the economic system and for the sort of future of the developed world, essentially. And I feel like it's topics that are just unaddressed by most of the mainstream for whatever reason that is. Perhaps we'll get into that later. But for example, on your website, it says your research led you to the uncomfortable conclusion that many developed countries, including the US and the UK, are unwittingly pursuing economic policies which will result in the unwinding of 20th century civilization before we reach the year 2050. That's a pretty horrifying proposition.
Well, it is a very horrifying proposition, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now, because I used to spend my time consulting with businesses and helping them think about their growth strategies and so on. And while I was doing that, I started to analyze the data on rising inequality in the US and the UK. And the more I looked at the data, the more horrified I became. And I realized that, we have a social contract. There are things we take for granted. In the UK, for example, we have a national health service, and we take it for granted that will be there. And if we get an illness that the treatment might cost tens of thousands of pounds, that's paid for through the tax system, and it's free at the point of delivery. But of course, that's not the only way you can run an economy. In the US, they don't have that. And the result is that actually 2/3 of personal bankruptcies in the States are from unexpected medical bills. So you can unwind the social contract. And the big danger for us is that we are in the process of unwinding many aspects of our social contract. And if we do that by the year 2050, we won't recognize the country we're living in.
Now, the inequality side of things is something we're going to get into. But just to start off, I wanted to try and get you to define something that you kind of lay out in some of your documents on the website, is that you lay out a difference between the golden age of capitalism and then market capitalism. So do you want to explain for people what they are and the differences between those two things?
Yes, absolutely. So in the book, I have looked at the post-war period, but from the end of the Second World War up to the year 2050 in 3 35-year chunks. So the first one, 1945 to 1980, that was the golden age of capitalism. That's not my term. That's a term that was actually very well known and has dropped out of use. But many countries, including the US and the UK, had their best ever economic period. So we called it the Golden Age. Germany talked about an economic miracle. Many other countries talked about an economic miracle. In France, they talked about les Trente Glorieuses. Each country had its own phrase for it, but it was a shared experience around the global economy of unprecedented economic growth. But even more importantly than that, an unprecedented sharing of economic growth, so that normal people felt the benefit of that economic growth. And so for a normal person, that was by far the best period in terms of improvement, actually, that we've ever seen. And that was then followed, and I guess we'll come into the reasons why it was followed by that in a minute, but that was then followed by another 35-year period, which is what I've called the age of market capitalism. And that period has seen a marked change, and it was looking at the data for that 35 years that made me very worried, because what we've seen over that period is a much lower rate of growth overall, which is bad news, but also it's been shared less fairly. So if you combine those two things, you've got a pie that's growing more slowly and you're sharing the pie less fairly. That means the typical person's slice, in America, for example, the American economy is vastly bigger than it was in 1980, but the typical person's slice is just about the same size. They've had virtually none of the benefit of growth, and quite a few people in the US are actually poorer than they would have been in 1980, which is extraordinary. So that's the results of those two periods. But they differ also in the underlying philosophy. So in the post-war period, the fundamental assumption was that we would try and build a world that was fit for people to live in, and the economy was a system that we would design and put in place to meet the needs of people. And it did, as I say, it did meet the needs of people extremely well for most people. It wasn't very good if you were in the top 0.01%, because you saw your share of the wealth diminishing. You were still enormously wealthy compared with a normal person, but the ratio of your wealth to their wealth was decreasing. Inequality was falling. So there was a kind of backlash that people thought, well, most people didn't, but people possessing huge amounts of capital thought, we don't want this to carry on. We don't like this. We don't think this is fair. And we should actually be shaping the economy to meet the needs of capital. And so markets are the way, you hear people use this phrase, markets are the best way to allocate resources. And what that really means is, well, we're not going to base the economy around the needs of people anymore. We're going to base it around the needs of capital. And if people aren't getting what they need out of the economy, that's because their market value is too low. So it's not that there's something wrong with the system, it's that there's something wrong with the people. And of course, the longer you do that, the more people start to suffer, and the more people you have to say there's something wrong with them. So I don't know if you remember when Mitt Romney was running for president, he made a speech which was, for him, unfortunately leaked, where he said, 47% of Americans pay no income tax, 47% take no responsibility for their lives. So you get to the point where you're having to write off half, or maybe even more than half. Maybe it will get to the point where you have to write off 99% of your own population as losers and wastrels and skivers and shirkers and all of these sorts of things in order to provide some kind of moral justification for what you're doing. But that's where we are. We're heading into a system where morality is defined as wealth. So if you're very wealthy, that proves that you've behaved morally because you must have created value to have been so wealthy. And conversely, if you're not very wealthy, well, that proves you've made some bad decisions somewhere along the line. And even when it comes to children, we heard in the UK, we heard Boris Johnson the other day talking about the catch-up funding, and he said that children of wealthy parents, obviously they would have private tuition, and that's right, because their parents have earned that through their hard work. So there's this kind of morality that pretends that hard work and being well paid are synonymous, which of course they are not, and even blames the children or penalizes the children if their parents aren't wealthy. So there's this extraordinary confusion of wealth and morality, which comes with this market fundamentalist ideal. So the results have been demonstrably poorer, and it has a very different and rather sinister underlying philosophy and underlying objective.
So, what was it that you think changed? Like, what happened when? So, you described it there as basically we've gone from an economy that serves the needs of the people versus an economy that serves the needs of capital. So that is essentially you're saying that prior to 1980, the economy was geared to helping rebuild the country after the war, to building things like the NHS, social programs, improving just the general welfare of the population and trying to raise everybody's standard of living. And since 1980, it has declined, or we've sort of moved towards the ultimate goal is to serve the money in society.
Yes.
Broadly. So what changed there around 1980? What was the in your mind, what changed?
Well, I think clearly in the post-war period, we know that very wealthy people weren't happy, and you know, if you look in the literature, you can see references to the servant problem and so on. So you know, people didn't like the idea of all these uppity people not wanting to be their servants for a pittance and all that kind of thing. So you know, you can understand it if you're the 10th generation of extraordinarily wealthy people in your family, and you might be the first one that can't afford a dozen gardeners. You know, you feel you've somehow been shortchanged and life has dealt you an unfair hand. But it was difficult for them to argue during the golden age while everything was demonstrably going so well. But in the 70s, there were two really big shocks to the economic system, which were the oil shocks. So in 1973 was the first oil shock, which was triggered. Wasn't exactly caused, but probably triggered by the Yom Kippur War, when the OPEC put the price of oil up by about 70%. But by the time that had sort of filtered through the system, they also reduced output a bit. So by the time all of that had filtered through the system, from that first oil shock, the price of oil rose 4 times. Now, if you think what a huge proportion of the economy was energy costs, I mean, it's still a huge proportion today, but it would have been even higher in the early 70s. So, of course, that's an enormous shock to the system, and that was followed towards the end of the 70s by the second oil shock. So 2 colossal shocks to the system, which actually no economic system can withstand a shock of that magnitude without some effect. And the effect was that growth was, by the standards of the golden age, growth was very poor in the 70s. So we often hear about how dreadful the 70s were. Actually, compared with the last 10 years, growth in the 70s was about twice as fast as it has been for the last 10 years. So when people talk about how dreadful the 70s were, it's worth comparing it with what we've actually been living through since the global financial crisis. But
is that just in terms of GDP? Sorry, before you keep going, is that just in terms of
yes, GDP? In terms of GDP. In terms of GDP, certainly, GDP per capita also, but more importantly and more starkly, in terms of what a typical person was actually taking home as their earnings. So in the 70s, people's earnings after inflation were still rising. They weren't rising as fast as they had been in the previous 25 years, but they were still rising through the 70s. In the last 10 years, they haven't. Most people in this country are now poorer than they would have been in 2007. So we've had 13 years of what we call mass impoverishment, where the majority of the population is actually finding they're getting poorer. That's far, far worse than anything that happened in the 70s. So the 70s have got this kind of mythical status as a dreadful decade. Actually, if we could have had the growth in GDP and the growth in income of the 70s, if we could have had that for the last 10 years, most people in this country would be far better off than they are today.
Wow. I mean, that's really stunning because I have actually heard that talking point so many times that like, oh, do you want to go back to the 70s? Like that was used so much during like.
Well, exactly. So the true answer is, well, in absolute terms, no. But in terms of growth of economy and growth in earnings, yes, I would very much switch back to the 70s. We would have had 10 years of much better growth.
Wow. I mean, it's stunning to hear that because I don't know, like someone of my generation, like a millennial, has never experienced what that period of growth may have been like. I mean, there's and you've kind of answered the one of the questions I wanted to go on to. So I want to ask you about this increase in inequality that we've seen over the past sort of 20 or 30 years. I mean, you could, I don't know where you want to sort of define where it began. We can just say in 1980, actually, to use your own parameters.
Yes, if we just start with 1980. So I mentioned that there was a different sort of underlying philosophy, and that manifests itself in the way that policy is formulated. So during the Golden Age, there was a recognition that government was a big part of the solution. Governments played an active role in steering the economy and making sure it would grow, in providing funding for fundamental research and all sorts of other investments. And people saw government as part of the solution. When Thatcher and Reagan came on the scene, Reagan famously said, well, government is the problem, not the solution. And that fits very well with this market fundamentalist idea, because if you can persuade people of that, then obviously if government's the problem, you want to shrink government. So that means you lower your taxes, you lower your government spending. And if you do that, what happens? Well, all of those institutions that were created to make the world fairer disappear, because actually the way they work is that you tax the people with the most money and you spend it to provide universal benefits like the NHS and now more and more means-tested benefits that only go to the poorest. If you unwind that, you are effectively unwinding the social contract. So it's inevitable that if you do that, you are going to achieve your goal of upwards redistribution, which was quite explicit, actually. I came across a couple of years ago a cabinet paper, which is now publicly available, from 1982 about long-term options for the UK. And it's very explicit that they were concerned about how to achieve redistribution upwards to the wealthiest. And part of that, absolutely, yeah. So on our website, there's an article called "What is the Market Fundamentalist Agenda?" and at the end of that, it has a link to this cabinet paper, and it quotes the section on public education and the section on the NHS. It's a shocking read, but it's really clear that this was an explicit agenda, upwards redistribution. So if that's your agenda, and you shrink government, then you are almost bound to increase inequality. And actually, that's a consequence that they were fully aware of and perfectly happy with. And gradually, it has happened. I mean, they still haven't completed their revolution, but they've made enormous progress over what is now 40 years. And that's the other thing that's very stark, that the Golden Age was brought to an end because of these oil crises, and that those crises were used as an excuse for some fundamental reform, which actually was very negative reform. Well, we had a huge crisis which was not caused by an external shock, but caused by instability of the system itself in the form of the global financial crisis, which really peaked in 2008. And was followed by the Great Recession, which was the biggest recession since the Great Depression. So we had all of that, and there's been no reform at all. In fact, there's been a doubling down of the policies that caused that. So it's very interesting how different the reaction has been to a blip which was clearly caused by outside influences, which was used as an excuse to remodel the whole thing, and a crisis that was actually self-generated by the nature of the financial system, and which has not caused any meaningful reform at all, and in fact was used to accelerate the transition to a market fundamentalist system, because it was used as the excuse for austerity. The government essentially said, well, we can't afford to do these things anymore, and created a very, very powerful myth of unaffordability, which is now which has for the last 10 years dominated government policy, which says, yes, we would love to feed starving children during the Christmas holidays, but we just can't afford it. And even though it's clearly nonsense, it still resonates with people, because we see the government can create money whenever it needs to. It didn't have any problem creating 37 billion for the test and trace system, which it spent in strange ways. The Bank of England has created 895 billion since 2009 through quantitative easing. So, people keep talking about how the government's in dire straits because the ratio of debt to GDP is 100% now, and that's used as the justification for this story of unaffordability. But it's absolute nonsense in at least two ways, actually many more than two, but two very simple ways. One is that 100% isn't high. 100% is actually the average level that we've had for the last 300 years. So if the headlines were all shrieking, government debt reaches 300-year average, people would, of course, shrug their shoulders and say, so what? Quite rightly. But because it's presented as some unprecedented thing which is going to bankrupt the nation and cripple our grandchildren's prospects, people are prepared to see an enormous unwinding of the social contract in the name of affordability. But secondly, that 100% is including 895 billion, which is owed to the Bank of England, because those bonds were bought by the Bank of England as part of the quantitative easing program. So almost half of it is money the government owes to itself. They could cancel it tomorrow if they wanted to. So the idea that there even is really 100% debt to GDP isn't true. It wouldn't matter if there were, but it's not even really an external debt. It's literally money that the government owes to the Bank of England.
Did you say 895 million or billion?
Billion.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
895 billion.
I didn't realize it got
so
that
it's
high.
Really quite a lot of money. Yeah, no, it started out much smaller. It started out, I think initially it was about 200 million with the very first slice, 200 billion, sorry, with the very first slice, which even then, 200 billion is a significant amount of money by most people's standards. But, now we're getting up towards a trillion. So, we are getting up towards half of the government debt is actually owed to the Bank of England, which again you never hear people talk about. So these things is public. Both of those two things that I said about the 300-year average and the extent of QE, both of those are publicly available. They're on the Bank of England website. So any journalist who wanted to know them and report about them could report about them with less than half an hour's research.
Why do you think they don't?
Well,
because it seems like a big story. It seems like a huge story, if I'm honest.
It is a big story, and it's extraordinary how little coverage it gets, despite the fact that people like me, and there are quite a few other people like me who've been trying to say these things. But despite that fact, it doesn't get much coverage. I believe, and perhaps I'm cynical, but the fact is, if you look at the ownership of most of our major news outlets, the Times, the Sun, the Star, the Express, etc., the Telegraph, the Mail, they are owned by, most of them are owned by one of four billionaires whose wealth is offshore, who have been avoiding tax for decades, and for whom the market fundamentalist ideal is their ideal. So they don't really want their pages to be full of stuff pointing out to their readers what is really going on and the dangers of the market fundamentalist agenda. They want people to be blaming foreigners or blaming the EU. And so if you look at the headlines, you can see what happens, that it's essentially, with a lot of those outlets, is essentially a distraction mechanism that, people have begun to feel poorer. Young people now, when I was born, my parents assumed that I would have more opportunities than they had had, and therefore would have reasonable chance of being better off than they had been. When they were born, their parents assumed the same thing about them. And in both cases, that turned out to be correct, that they did have better opportunities than my grandparents, and I did have better opportunities than they had had. When my children were born, I assumed that this was like a law of nature, that each new generation would have better prospects than the last, because in living memory, that had been the formula. And now, of course, we have a generation, my children's generation, where it's no longer obvious at all that things are going to be better for them. Some things are much, much harder for them than they were for me at an equivalent age. Now, what's really important is that this is a political choice. It's not inevitable that we move away from that thing that we all thought was a law of nature. We could perfectly well get back to that law of nature. We could get back to a situation where people have a very reasonable expectation that life for a normal person in 2050 will be much better than life is today. And that gives us nearly 30 years to see some big improvement, but we would need to see policy change. And that policy change, coming back to your question about the media owners, that policy change would be very good for my children and their children and most people's children. It actually wouldn't be particularly good for Rupert Murdoch and his children, or Lord Rothermere and his children. They would be better off with the current system.
Somebody please think of the trust fund children.
Exactly. Yes.
It's your comment about cynicism actually reminds me of a quote I heard about a week ago from Dr. Brett Weinstein, and he said, "No matter how cynical I think I am, it turns out I'm still naive." It's
well, yes. I do have that feeling sometimes. I made when we launched the book 99%. I mentioned that we had a public launch for it, and I made a speech which was about understanding the coup in the Tory party. So this was in September 2019, and I said, the Tory party has been taken over by extreme right-wingers. And at the time, I was very worried that people would think, well, this is alarmist nonsense, because nobody was really saying that at the time. And now, if I reread the speech, I think, well, it's absolutely spot on, but I could have been a bit more hard-hitting, really. So, it's amazing how you can, you think you're being cynical, but actually you are being still naive.
I mean, I found that very much when I was trying to explain the points of my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, actually, if anyone wants to order it. It's that I was trying to point out that shocks like austerity had been used, or going the whole way back to the oil shock that you talked about in the 70s, had been used to put forward this. I hadn't described it as market fundamentalist. I'd sort of broadly described it as like free market neoliberalism, or just this free market capitalism as pushed by Milton Friedman, essentially the Chicago School of Economics. And I was like, look, this will be used to bring in more of these policies because these people are funded by incredibly rich right wing billionaires, and I remember speaking to my family, and who are like really intelligent guy, specifically my cousin who did accounting and lives in London, is very, very switched on and plugged in, and he said, I think you're being a bit paranoid. And I was like, and now I feel like so vindicated,
absolutely.
but I don't want to be.
No. But you're exactly right. So there's one chapter in my book which explains the market fundamentalist philosophy, and I had started writing the book in 2015, so I had a reasonable early draft in 2016, which I shared with some friends. And one of them is a company chairman of a couple of PLCs. And when he read that chapter, he said, yeah, this is fine, but nobody seriously thinks like that. No serious person thinks like that. Now what we can see is that we've got a cabinet which is absolutely stuffed with people who we know think like that because they've written about their beliefs, and we can see that they have exactly that kind of belief. But I mean that's changed just between 2016 and 2019, that it went from something where a very well-informed, highly educated person could believe that nobody serious thinks like that, to a point where the cabinet is stuffed full of people who no longer are even denying it. That's quite a sudden shift.
Yeah, I mean, the veil has been somewhat lifted. And I mean, it makes it easier to talk about these issues because people will sort of entertain the ideas a lot more. And it kind of gives me hope, yes, because, I don't know, I get very despairing sometimes. And I'm like, how can we change this system without, like, some sort of massive, disruptive revolution of some form? Are you familiar with Strauss-Howe intergenerational theory?
I'm not.
Okay, so I'll give a like very, very quick thing. It's basically saying that every 80 to 100 years, humanity goes through this like crisis, renewal, entropy crisis cycle again and again and again and again. And the suggestion is that the authors had proposed in the 1980s that around 2020 to 25, we were going to see this big, huge collapse and the renewal of the system. Because they say that like you need this crisis because people eventually get cynical, the system degrades, and eventually the institutions that were rebuilt lose their purpose, and you just get this period of sort of entropy towards collapse and renewal. Do you think it's possible for us to address the issues that you're talking about and fix this without some sort of major crisis or revolution, or I don't know what form it takes, but do you think we can get there without the madness?
Well, we can't get there without a crisis. We're in a crisis. We're in several different crises right now. So there's no way of avoiding a crisis. And of course, we haven't really talked about it, but there's a climate crisis as well, which is intimately linked with this, because if you're a market fundamentalist, you don't want to re-engineer businesses to make them green and make them carbon neutral. You want to just permit them to carry on doing what they're doing. And if it causes crises, well, those crises are predictable. If you play your cards right, you can make money out of those crises. So really, what's the problem? So we've got the crises. It is, I believe, absolutely possible without very, very radical change for us to get back onto a much better path. And we have the evidence in our own history that it's possible for us to have a much more successful system. Also, there are more than 200 countries in the world. If you look around the world, you'll see a lot of them are run very, very badly, but some of them are run much better than others. And you can see, well, actually, there are some things that we could learn from those successful ones if we wanted to learn the lesson. And so we could make a series of changes which would be perhaps radical reform, but wouldn't, in theory, need to be a revolution. We wouldn't need to have mass executions in the streets and so on to achieve this change. Now, of course, the fact that it's possible doesn't mean that we will do those things. And my guess is that if we don't do them peacefully, then there will be some kind of revolution or something. But I'm hopeful for two reasons that we can do it all peacefully. One is that the facts are very clear. If you actually go to the facts, you go to the source, it's like climate change. People can deny it as much as they like, but actually the facts are clear. And it's the same with these economic things. When I was doing the research from the book, I kept thinking, this is so obvious. These facts are so clear that if enough people become aware of the facts, then we will see pressure build to change. And Extinction Rebellion, I think, did a very good job of moving the climate crisis from something which everybody had heard of, but they didn't take it very seriously, into being something which everybody thinks, actually, this is urgent, we need to be acting right now. So, in principle, we know that that kind of change in consciousness can be achieved. And secondly, it's just the numbers. 99% plus of the population do not want to see the market fundamentalist idea implemented. There are many people who are comfortably into the top 1% who would hate to see a future like that being built. So we're really talking about a very tiny number of enormously influential people who are holding this whole thing together. But they can't do anything on their own. They can only do it with the complicity, witting or unwitting, of the other 99.9%. And if it gets to the point where we have the same sort of or even hopefully greater level of awareness of what this market fundamentalist agenda is actually doing, as we do of climate change, then I think there's a very real prospect that the combination of the force of numbers, the fact that they can't actually do anything on their own, and the fact that all the evidence is really very unequivocal, means that we have a real prospect of a peaceful transition to a much better state rather than having to have a revolution.
So perhaps it would be a good time here to lay out what exactly you think we need to change and sort of perhaps even not even change but reverse in terms of the reforms that have been made since 1980. So if you had to put out, say, the top three things that would address these problems, what would they look like?
Am I allowed 5? Because we normally talk about 5 things.
Go for 5.
Thank you very much. So the first one is a democratic reset. Effectively, what we have seen is a drift from a true democracy where everybody in this country is well informed about what's going on. They vote for parties which are truthful about what their agenda is, and therefore, they are able to vote in their own interests. We've drifted away from that, so we need some kind of democratic reset, and we've set out a number of things within that. The first of which is that there should be an explicit, legal, enforceable duty of a government to govern for the whole population, not for the benefit of a tiny but influential subset, and there should be teeth associated with that. There are some other things as well. Clearly, government is important, but there are other levers of power that can be pulled. And we've seen, particularly in the States, how with Donald Trump, he came very close to getting control of all of those other levers of power. So he was able to stuff the Supreme Court, etc. So there needs to be really clear constitutional protection for separation of powers. There needs to be limits on media ownership so that you can't simply have 4 market fundamentalist billionaires controlling the whole of the narrative, etc. So a number of actions around simply strengthening the Constitution to protect the population as a whole. The second thing is fact-based policy. Now, that sounds such an obvious thing to say that you would say, well, why do you bother to say it? But the truth is, by far the dominant policy and a hugely damaging policy for the last 10 years has been austerity. And that we've talked a bit about that. That was justified on this myth of unaffordability, which itself was justified on all sorts of further myths, but they all culminate in this very powerful myth that government simply can't afford to keep us as a civilized nation anymore. So even if we don't like it, we just have to shrug our shoulders and accept that unwinding of the social contract. So fact-based policy, and that should include, ideally, again, penalties for misleading the public. So anyone with a big platform should have a duty to make sure that what they say is true, and if it isn't true, they should have to correct it loudly and publicly, and if they don't, there should be real penalties for that. But also, it would be good to see, explicitly fact-based debates in Parliament. So it's extraordinary to me, we still have a Parliament where the nature of the debate is really which side can bray more loudly than the other side. There isn't a screen where you could put up a graph that would demonstrate the facts and anchor the debate in the facts. We don't have a fact-based debate in Parliament hardly ever, because it's all about rhetorical point scoring. And the truth is, rhetoric is a fantastically powerful tool. You can make very powerful rhetorical arguments in favor of all sorts of dreadful positions, and people do. And that's how they're able to get dreadful policies through. So fact-based policy, very important. On the foundation of those two, you can then think, well, what should those policies be? Now, any individual policy, as you know, is really complex. You have to do a lot of hard work to think through what are the implications, what would be the unexpected consequences of this policy, will I actually make things worse if I do this rather than better? But at the end of the day, there are only 4 types of policy, because every policy either grows the pie or it doesn't, and it either shares it fairly or it doesn't. So you could have a policy that both grows the pie and shares it fairly, so we call that a shared growth policy, and that would be things like investing in fundamental research or investing in healthcare, investing in all sorts of things which we haven't really been doing very much of. You could have a captured growth policy that was good for growing the pie, but actually created a lot of casualties. It didn't share the benefits. So something like very aggressive automation could be good for growing the pie, because it could enable us to provide more valuable goods and services with a fraction of the number of people, and that could be good for providing what the population needs. But at the same time, you could imagine a huge number of severe casualties of people who used to have a job and who are now unemployed. So if you don't have any balancing policies, which is the third type, if you don't have anything like that, then you're simply creating an underclass. And that actually makes it impossible to do certain things that you might want to do. In France, you remember when Macron wanted to introduce his fuel tax surcharge, which he was doing for climate change reasons. Well, actually, in a way, that's not a bad idea. That would have been a good thing for the economy as a whole in terms of rebalancing it, making it greener. But he was not thinking about the casualties. And of course, the real casualties from a policy like that are the people who haven't got very much money and need to drive every day for work or for school run or whatever. And they're the ones who are paying this extra duty. So if he, instead of doing it that way, thought, okay, that would be stupid not to have a balancing policy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to announce a green dividend, which I'm going to pay to the bottom 25% of French earners and those in poverty. So they are going to receive a green dividend, which I'm going to fund by a fuel tax surcharge. Then suddenly you create a completely different narrative, which instead of saying, well, we don't like your fuel tax surcharge because it costs us, you'd have people saying, we like your green dividend. And yeah, we are going to think about when we buy another car, we'll obviously be trying to buy an electric one. So it would have been a far more successful way by thinking of it in those terms. So the key point of that is that a good policy portfolio is a balanced policy portfolio. Of course, you want to have the shared growth policies. You probably do want some captured growth policies because they can be very powerful. But when you do that, you need to balance them. And then the fourth kind is what we've called vulture policies, which are policies which neither grow the pie nor share it fairly. If you shrink the pie, of course, somebody's slice is going to have to shrink. And A vulture policy is one that says, yes, the pie is going to shrink, but it's not going to be the rich people's slices who shrink. So actually a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit is a good example of that, because there are people who are doing extremely well out of the shock of a hard Brexit, but most people will not, and that was entirely predictable. So we simply shouldn't be having vulture policies anymore. So that's the third step, is that thinking about policies through that lens and creating a sensible portfolio of policies. The fourth action is investing more wisely in the future. We've been very unwisely underinvesting. It's a bit as if I decide that out of prudence, I'm not going to fix the leak in the roof in my house, and I pretend that's responsible management. Of course, it's not. I'm going to get dry rot or wet rot, or the house will fall down. It's not prudent of me not to replace the missing tiles. But that's the way we've been running. And then the last one is about creating what we call clean competitive markets. So there's a story about the way that business works, which is that if there's a need in society, an entrepreneur can step in and meet that need and simultaneously make money for him or herself and meet the needs of the public as a whole. And therefore, business is ethical, and more profit is more ethical than less profit. But if you look at the world, actually, you see it's not quite like that. It is true that the profit motive is a powerful force, but it's not true that the most successful businesses are the most ethical ones. So at the moment, in the US, the 5 largest businesses, which account, I think, for 20% of the value of the S&P 500, are Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon. So those are 5 huge businesses. They are all under investigation for anti-competitive practices. They all avoid their taxes. Amazon is notorious for the way that it mistreats its employees. Facebook has been seen to be complicit in various abuses of democracy. So the idea that these are the 5 most ethical businesses, I don't think anyone would even try to claim that. So there's a disconnect has opened up between the profit motive and what actually makes for business success, so that conventional story that good behavior is good for business is broken. So we need to get that story to become true, and the way to do that is to charge businesses for their externalities. So at the moment, if you and I are both running a business, you run yours ethically and I run mine unethically. So you pay all your staff a true living wage. They don't need to top it up for anything else. They've got enough to live on. I don't. I pay them the minimum wage, or maybe even I find a way to sneak a bit below the minimum wage. So it's not really a true living wage, and they have to claim in-work benefits, or the bank of mum and dad has to support them. Somehow the rest of society is subsidizing my payroll. Similarly, you pay all your graduates enough that they can repay their student loans. I don't. I still benefit from their graduate skills, but I don't pay them that much. So the rest of society is paying to educate people for those graduate skills that I'm making use of. You pay your taxes in full. I don't. My lorries drive on the roads that your taxes pay for. The rest of society is subsidizing my tax bill as well. And finally, I'm not carbon neutral. I pollute without any consideration of the consequences. The rest of society picks up the tab. You have invested heavily to become carbon neutral or even carbon negative. And so you're a poster boy for ethical business, but you're at a cost disadvantage compared with me. And if nobody stops me, I'm going to drive you out of business. And so not only is my business bad from a sort of static perspective because of these externalities, but dynamically it's bad because it's distorted competition, and it's going to drive the bad businesses will drive the good ones out of business. And we're seeing far too much of that now. So ultimately, what we'd like to do is to see the accounting standards change so that profit actually reflects real profit. All those externalities are stripped back out again, and ultimately the businesses will be charged. So if they are showing a profit, they're really making a profit. They're not simply having this involuntary subsidy from from the rest of society. So that's a long answer, but those are the 5 actions that we're pushing for.
Wow. I mean, that is, you've no idea how much more hopeful I feel right now. Like, I mean, that'll probably dissipate when I see some horrible action from the government, but like right now, I'm just stunned that someone like yourself is articulating things that I've considered to be a problem, but never quite understood exactly how we fix it. It's fantastic to hear someone lay out in such you said it's a long answer, but ultimately you've put in about 5 minutes concisely how we attempt to fix all of the monstrous problems with our current like political, economic, and financial setup, and you've done it in an absolutely amazing way that is like understandable, easily digestible, and just beautifully succinct, and seems like common sense. I'm blown away. Like you've done a fantastic job there. The thing that sprung out actually most at me was the fact-based debate in Parliament, because something that like podcasters or like YouTubers often bring up is like, if they have someone on their show and they're sitting there in person and someone says something, they go, hang on, can we look that up? And they fact check them in real time, and that just like Lindsay Hoyle isn't sitting there in Parliament saying, hang on, have you got a source on that? Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you had that, if you had the live fact checking in Parliament, debates would be transformed. People wouldn't even come and, I know one's not meant to use unparliamentary language like saying they lie, but they wouldn't even try to come and lie to the House, because they would be instantly, it would flash up on the screen, claim false, and the true number underneath. You know, it would transform debate, it would transform policy making.
Yeah, that's really stunning. So just to finish up here, because I'm aware we're getting close on time, could you lay out for us what the alternative is? Like, what do you think happens if we don't address these problems and we get to 2050? Like, what do you see happening?
Well, if we don't address any of the problems, then forecasting is of course notoriously difficult, but one thing you could easily do is just to extrapolate the trends. And if you extrapolate the trends for the last 10 years, then what you see is that the UK won't look like a prosperous Northern European, what we call civilized country. It would look much more like South Africa, which is the world's most unequal country, looks like today, where you've got a tiny elite who live on their luxurious estates, and they've surrounded themselves with intense security because the rest of the population is living either in poverty or not very far above poverty, and they're desperate, and so crime rates are high and so on. So, you know, as a sort of picture in your mind, you can imagine Britain having turned into that sort of thing. So you would drive past these grand residences with their tall walls with the CCTVs on the top. If you could still afford a car, that is, you would be driving past those grand residences, but you wouldn't be able to. You'd have no realistic prospect of any such life for yourself. You wouldn't be able to afford to buy a house. A lot of young people already can't buy a house, so you'd be living in some kind of slum that you were renting from those people in their grand estates. Climate change wouldn't have been tackled because it's not in their interests to tackle it, or at least so far they don't perceive it is. So actually things would be worse. It wouldn't be just like England as it looks today. You know, all of the impacts of climate change, direct and indirect, would be magnified by 2050. So you know, who knows what would happen to all the refugees that would produce. Either there would be kind of genocide by climate change, or there would be an enormous refugee issue. So coupled with our domestic problems, we would be taking in refugees. So it's, either genocide or refugees from the climate change. It's a very, very dystopian picture if we just say, no, let's just trust, let things roll on.
And I guess people are already getting glimpses of that coming. It doesn't feel far away, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Like I think what you described there is...
No, I don't. I mean, 2050 isn't very far away. It's 30 years away. Even in the time I've been working on the book, when I started the book, it was 35 years away, which is why I worked in these 35-year chunks. It's only 30 years away, so that's five years. 1/7 of that time is gone. We haven't made any progress in tackling those issues in the last 5 years. So the threat is very, very serious. But I think you're right. I think people are beginning to wake up to it, just as Extinction Rebellion has woken people up to the climate change. I think people are waking up to some of these other things. I think a lot of millennials and younger people understand these issues actually much, much better than most older people do. But quite a lot of older people do understand it as well. This isn't purely a generational thing, but in terms of information, outlets like the Mail and the Express have a very elderly readership, so it's not surprising that there's going to be an asymmetry in how well informed people are on these sorts of issues. No, I think you're right. I think awareness will build, and I'm hopeful that if we can take those 5 actions that I talked about a few minutes ago, we can do all of that. You can see from the way I described them, that doesn't require a revolution. It requires, well, perhaps a revolution in mindset, but not a revolution in the conventional sense of a revolution at all. That could be done actually quickly and easily if you just had a government that really wanted to do it. You could start to turn the tanker in a year. It's a tanker, so it wouldn't be pointing in the right direction in a year. But you could move the rudder. You could start the process of change, and little by little, the benefits would feed through. The Golden Age didn't transform people's lives in 1 year, but it did over a 35-year period.
If people are sitting here and saying, okay, this is amazing, Mark, I love what you're saying, I'm inspired, what can they do to try and get involved with what you're doing, or try and make some change and push forward the ideas that you're laying out here?
Well, they can join the 99% organization. So at the time the book was published, I hope the book would be well received, but I also thought it doesn't really matter whether it is well received or not, because it won't on its own do anything. Books on their own hardly ever achieve change, and really I was writing it to try to achieve change. So with a few friends and with my wife, set up the 99% organization in 2019. So at that time we had 4 members. Now we have about 1,250 members, all of whom are volunteers, and the way they get engaged varies. So some people just want to be informed and they want to get the newsletters and find out more because they find it interesting and useful to understand what's really going on. But about 5% are heavily engaged, and so they get involved in projects. So we've got 6 projects going on now, which are all aimed at trying to bring about those 5 actions in various ways. So those projects are mainly about top-down change. So they range from making political contacts with MPs across all parties, because actually we believe that people, reasonable MPs in all parties would sign up to those 5 actions. And so far, that does appear to be true. We have a project which is about local engagement. So those 1,200 members, if most people have never written to the local newspaper or to an MP, I hadn't written to an MP until fairly recently. So people are nervous about doing it, and they don't know how to do it. So that local campaign can help them to write to their local newspaper or to write to their MP in such a way as to raise awareness of these issues and begin to help MPs to be aware that this is the job they should be doing. We have one which is called Generation 99, which is aimed specifically at younger people. We talked quite a lot about the year 2050. Now, I am personally interested in the year 2050 because I'm hoping to be there to see it, but I should be slightly past the first flush of my youth by the time we get there. But my children's generation, they will be in their 30s and 40s, and even people who are in their 50s, they'll be at the prime of their lives, careers. They'll be running the world. Now, a lot of younger people have become disengaged politically. So, for example, we saw in the Brexit vote that younger people voted in far fewer numbers, even than the over 75s. And in fact, if they voted in the same proportion as the over 75s, we'd still be in the EU today, which is an extraordinary thought. So actually, that generation, the 18 to 34 group, they did have the power at the time of that referendum. They did have that power, but they didn't realize they had that power and they didn't exercise it. So we're trying to work with members of that group to help them to realize that power, to articulate what they want, and then to think about how to go about getting it. We have one which is tackling that problem of externalization, working with other organizations that are looking at, this is a very long-term issue, unfortunately, but how to get the accounts changed so that the ethical businesses will outcompete the unethical ones. We have one which is actually is a bottom-up project. It's taking one regional area, which happens to be Herefordshire, where I live, and saying, well, if the county work together, the council and the business community and the third sector and the educational community, if everybody had a shared vision of where the county could get to by 2030, how many people could we lift out of poverty? How much could we reduce the carbon footprint? How much could we make the county, the economy grow? Those sorts of issues. And that's actually a very exciting project because we are getting into the policy formulation in a sense in that project and looking to build that coalition within the county. So how many is that? I've lost count. But anyway, that gives you a flavour. So we've got these 6 projects, and they're quite different. One, as you've heard, they're very different one from the other. So different people find different projects exciting, and they sign up to whichever project they're most excited in. And yes, I did forget one, which is very important, which is our most recent project, which is about protecting the NHS. So you're aware that the government has a white paper, and then again in the Queen's speech has made it clear that they're intending to reform the NHS. We and a lot of other people are very concerned that when they say reform the NHS, what they actually mean is create something that looks much more like the American system. Now, the American system is a standout performer by world standards because it costs twice as much as any other system and it produces worse results. So it is good for one thing, which is that it generates a lot of profit for all the players involved, but it's not good for healthcare. So it's not what most people in this country would like to see as a replacement for the NHS. And so we have that project, which is for people who are concerned about that and who see having a proper, well-functioning NHS free at the point of use as an essential part of our social contract. And they want to make sure that when we get to 2050, that's still in place and that the NHS is thriving rather than being a brand name that's associated with something that nobody uses anymore because it's been so terribly underfunded. So that's the 6th project. So people can join up, and they can do anything from just read the newsletters in order to be informed. They can come along to various meetings that we have where they can get to meet other people and they can discuss these issues, but they still might not have time to do much more than that. Or if they have got the time and the energy, then we would love to have more people supporting those 6 projects.
Well, that seems like a very, very nice place on which to finish things. Mark, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been incredibly educational and inspiring. And everyone, please go buy Mark's book, 99%, and check out the website. I will put links for everything in the description below. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. Don't forget our sponsor, ExpressVPN, and my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, can both be found in the links in the description below. And also, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It's the best way to help us grow. Until next time, thanks for listening.